You know that feeling when someone thinks they have all the power, until reality slaps them in the face? That was exactly what happened one quiet afternoon in my neighborhood. It started innocently. Enough. A routine stroll to my car, but it quickly spiraled into a full-blown HOA meltdown that nobody saw coming. And trust me, this wasn't just any HOA encounter. This was Karen-level chaos. The kind of story you'd think only happens on the internet. Until it happens to you. I was walking toward my car in the community parking lot, enjoying the rare peace of a Saturday morning, when I noticed her. Karen. You know the type. A woman who lives for control, armed with a clipboard, a scowl, and an unshakable belief that she's in charge of everyone's life. This Karen had something extra though, a master key. One of those shiny HOA keys that supposedly opens every garage, storage unit, and car in the complex. Or so she thought. She strutted toward my vehicle like a queen approaching her throne, key in hand, her eyes narrowing as she sized me up. "That car isn't supposed to be parked here," she muttered, scanning the lot like a hawk. I smiled politely because honestly, I wasn't worried. I knew the rules. And I also knew a little secret that Karen had no idea about. I wasn't just some homeowner. I was a U.S. Marshal. And suddenly, the balance of power was about to shift. Karen jabbed her key into my door with a sense of authority that only comes from unearned confidence. Click, nothing. She jiggled, twisted, and even tried a few more desperate maneuvers. Each attempt failed spectacularly. Her scowl deepened, turning almost comical, like a cartoon villain frustrated that the hero wouldn't surrender. And then it happened. Classic Karen move. She whipped out her phone, dialing 911 as if the mere act of calling would force my car to obey her. Within minutes, the lot was buzzing with confusion. Neighbors peeked out of windows, whispering, snapping photos, completely unaware that this parking dispute was about to escalate into something far more intense than they could imagine. Karen's voice rang out over the phone, dramatic and indignant. "He's refusing to comply. You need to send someone now!" I leaned against my car, calm, letting her fury build, knowing full well the chaos about to unfold would be her biggest mistake ever. What she didn't know, what nobody knew at that moment, was that her actions had triggered the wrong person. The one person in the neighborhood who didn't just follow the rules. I enforced them. And the story that followed would leave everyone questioning what control really means in an HOA. The first sound of sirens cut through the quiet suburban morning like a knife. Karen, still clutching her phone, practically vibrated with excitement. In her mind, she had summoned authority, and soon I would be forced to submit. But reality has a funny way of humbling people, and Karen was about to learn that lesson in real time. By the time 2 patrol cars pulled into the lot, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, drawn by the shrill mix of sirens, shouting, and Karen's theatrical declarations. She turned to face me, puffed up with self-importance, and waved the phone like a wand. "See? They're here because of you! You can't do this!" The officers stepped out, hands on their belts, professional, scanning the scene. They were expecting a simple parking dispute, maybe a belligerent resident refusing to move. They were not expecting a U.S. Marshal casually leaning against his vehicle, completely calm. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice light. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The officers looked at me, then at Karen, whose indignation was now reaching peak levels. She launched into a tirade, pointing at my car and explaining with escalating panic that I had refused her master key and was obstructing her authority. Her words spilled over like a broken dam, each one more exaggerated than the last. I could see the skepticism on the officers' faces. Karen's story was, well, let's say creative. She spoke of master keys and supposed violations as if her version of reality had any legal weight. Meanwhile, I simply waited, calm, measured, observing. I let her anger do the talking. Every word she screamed only added credibility to my eventual reveal. Then, after a few tense minutes, she made her critical error. She turned her back to check her phone again, fuming, leaving her precious master key momentarily exposed. That's when I decided to escalate, not with force, but with revelation. I cleared my throat and casually said, "For everyone's clarity, I'm actually a U.S. Marshal. You've just called 911 on a federal officer." The crowd went silent. Karen froze mid-sentence, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The officer's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and professional recalibration. Karen's whole perception of authority collapsed instantly. The confidence she had built on a foundation of HOA rules crumbled into sheer panic. By now, neighbors were whispering, some laughing nervously, some in awe. Karen tried to speak, tried to assert herself, but the words stuck. She realized too late that this wasn't a parking dispute. It was a lesson in misjudging the wrong person. The officers stepped back, giving me space. Karen's indignation was now a mix of shock and humiliation, and she was scrambling to regain control that no longer existed. I could already see this was going to become neighborhood legend. Karen's face was a masterpiece of disbelief and fury, a textbook example of someone realizing they had underestimated their target. She had come in armed with her master key, her sense of entitlement, and a confidence that bordered on delusional. But now, standing in front of a calm U.S. Marshal, all of that bravado evaporated faster than steam on a hot pan. And, as anyone who has ever witnessed a Karen meltdown knows, humiliation only fuels the fire. She took a step toward me, hand trembling, as if sheer aggression could somehow rewrite reality. You can't do this! I have authority here," she sputtered, pointing at the HOA badges she clutched like medals of honor. The officers exchanged looks, eyebrows raised. Authority? She had confused a local HOA with federal law enforcement. That distinction had never been more painfully obvious. Karen pivoted, rallying her narrative like a general attempting a last-ditch attack. She waved her phone wildly, mumbling about reporting me for obstruction, violating community rules, and the consequences that were somehow meant to intimidate me. But instead of fear, all I felt was an almost cinematic sense of inevitability. Every word she shouted was a step deeper into chaos, and the entire neighborhood had become her unintended audience. One neighbor, a teenage boy on a skateboard, snickered audibly from the edge of the lot. Karen's glare could have frozen fire. She turned sharply, scanning the small crowd as if to demand loyalty or at least silence. But the more she screamed, the more amused the onlookers became. What was meant to be her stage, a show of dominance, was turning into a public spectacle of embarrassment. Then came her most desperate move. She tried once more to use her master key on my car, twisting it as though sheer willpower could override federal jurisdiction. Click, nothing. The key, the symbol of her authority, was useless. Her frustration reached its peak, and she muttered something under her breath about rules being broken and someone needing to teach me a lesson. Little did she know she was playing checkers while I was several moves ahead in chess. I leaned casually against my car, letting her simmer, letting the tension build. The officers maintained their professional distance, no longer concerned about a simple HOA dispute but now observing the unraveling of a neighborhood legend in real time. Karen's meltdown was spectacular, each shout, each gesticulation, a display of hubris meeting its match. By the time she finally stepped back, panting, red-faced, and glaring daggers, the truth had settled in. Her sense of power was illusion, her authority meaningless in this context. And the lesson? Never underestimate the person standing quietly in front of you. Karen stood frozen, her chest heaving, eyes darting between me, her useless master key, and the gathering crowd. For a moment, it seemed like she might storm off in defeat. But her ego wasn't ready to admit total failure. Instead, she started muttering about filing complaints and reporting this incident to the HOA board, her voice quivering. between rage and desperation. The officers, calm and professional, simply observed, knowing this was no longer about parking. It was about ego, authority, and the consequences of misjudgment. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some filming on their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Word spreads fast in a suburban community, but this? This was legendary material. Karen, previously feared for her HOA enforcement antics, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Every attempt she made to regain control only dug the hole deeper. Her master key, the tool she had wielded like a scepter, lay impotent in her hand, a symbol of her vanishing influence. I finally stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. Karen, the law doesn't work the way you think. That key doesn't give you authority over me or anyone outside your HOA jurisdiction. The words seemed to hit her like a shockwave. She tried to interject, sputtering about rules and violations, but I raised a hand politely. Please, let's avoid escalating further. You've already involved law enforcement unnecessarily. That's enough. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the color draining from her face. The officers, after confirming my identity and authority, began explaining to her that any further harassment could result in serious consequences. Karen's eyes widened. The realization that she had crossed a line she couldn't come back from was sinking in. Panic replaced indignation as she frantically tried to rationalize her actions. But reason had left the building. Meanwhile, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some neighbors approached me cautiously, asking questions. Others simply laughing quietly at the absurdity of what had just transpired. I stayed composed, letting Karen's meltdown serve as a live demonstration of what happens when entitlement meets reality. Finally, defeated and humiliated, she turned on her heel and stomped toward her car, muttering threats about "this isn't over and the HOA will hear about you." But by now, the spectacle had already cemented itself in the neighborhood's memory. Every step she took was a reminder of how quickly power can evaporate when based on fear and assumptions rather than facts. And as Karen drove off, leaving chaos and whispers behind, the lesson became clear. Never underestimate someone quietly standing in their truth. Authority isn't given by keys or titles, it's earned, and trying to wield it recklessly can backfire spectacularly. Karen's retreat should have signaled the end of the chaos, but in true HOA Karen fashion, she wasn't finished. Driving off didn't erase the humiliation or the fact that she had just called 911 on a federal officer. By the time she returned home, the neighborhood whispers had already amplified into stories, being shared across texts, social media, and between fences. The legend of her meltdown had begun its life, one she could never take back. Within hours, the HOA board had been flooded with messages. Some neighbors defended Karen, others simply laughed at the spectacle, and a few reached out to me privately, curious but cautious. The irony wasn't lost. Karen had tried to assert authority and ended up exposing herself to scrutiny she hadn't anticipated. Her master key, the supposed symbol of control, had become a punchline. And for her, the consequences were just beginning. The next HOA meeting was a revelation. Karen, usually a commanding presence, arrived flustered and defensive, attempting to recount her version of events. The room, however, was less sympathetic this time. Neighbors shared first-hand accounts, phones in hand, showing videos of her futile attempts to open my car and the frantic 911 call. Board members, trying to maintain professionalism, reminded everyone of legal boundaries, insurance liabilities, and the risks of overstepping authority. Karen's confident assertions had crumbled. She was now the cautionary tale. Meanwhile, I stayed in the background, letting the story unfold without interference. My presence wasn't necessary. Facts spoke for themselves. Karen's attempts to salvage credibility only dug the hole deeper. Her words clashed with evidence, her accusations fell flat, and her ego, bruised and battered, became the focal point. The irony was rich. The very tools she relied on, authority, master keys, and fear tactics, were powerless against truth and law. By the end of the meeting, the HOA board made one thing clear: harassment, false reports, and overstepping boundaries could have serious repercussions. Karen left with a formal warning, her aura of invincibility completely dismantled. Meanwhile, neighbors whispered, laughed quietly, and shook their heads at the spectacle. The story already cemented as neighborhood lore. As for me, the incident became another reminder of the delicate balance between civility and authority. I returned to my car, calm, reflecting on how easily misunderstandings escalate when ego outweighs logic. Karen had called 911 expecting compliance. She got a lesson instead, a lesson in humility, boundaries, and the limits of her HOA power. And the moral? In the end, respect isn't demanded. It's earned. Misjudge who you're confronting, and you might just find yourself outmatched, outclassed, and out of patience. Karen learned that the hard way, and the neighborhood will never forget.